welcome to The Debate. You are staring at a blank document.
A terrifying feeling, really.
It really is. The cursor is blinking rhythmically. You know exactly what you need to accomplish. Maybe it is writing a complex legal brief or structuring a difficult piece of code, and yet you feel an overwhelming, almost physical paralysis keeping your hands off the keyboard.
Yeah, we have all been there.
We certainly have. The question we are exploring today is how we actually diagnose that paralysis. Is that inability to start fundamentally a deep psychological fear of failure?
Or are you simply experiencing a biological lack of activation energy, a problem you could literally solve with a cup of coffee and a stick of gum?
Precisely. Today, we are analyzing the coffee gum productivity stack, which is often colloquially referred to as the $2 productivity stack. It is a dual input strategy combining caffeine and mastication to overcome procrastination and trigger deep work.
It is a fascinating collision of neurochemistry and behavioral psychology, but it raises a critical question about how we manage our own resistances.
Right, which brings us to our central disagreement today. Is this combination a highly effective, biologically grounded on-ramp for the brain that bridges the physiological gap of caffeine processing? Or is it a superficial behavioral crutch that risks exacerbating the root causes of procrastination by providing blind stimulation without direction?
The line is incredibly thin.
I represent the view that the stack is a highly leveraged synergistic tool that physically anchors the nervous system and lowers the activation energy required for difficult tasks.
And I represent the perspective that, well, while the biology is real, the stack risks dependency theater and misdiagnoses emotional procrastination as a mere lack of energy.
I want to start by laying out exactly why the stack is so biologically compelling. We are not just throwing two random stimulants at a wall here.
Right, there is a mechanism.
Exactly. This is a deliberate strategy targeting two different physiological pathways. It starts with establishing a chemical floor. Coffee delivers caffeine, and caffeine has a very specific mechanism of action in the brain.
The adenosine blockade.
Yes. Throughout the day, your neurons produce a byproduct called adenosine. When adenosine binds to receptors in the brain, it acts like a metabolic parking brake, signaling that you are tired. Caffeine essentially slips into those receptors and blocks them.
So it doesn't give you energy per se?
No, it intercepts the sleepiness signal. And simultaneously, this blockade triggers a downstream release of dopamine and adrenaline. So you guarantee the brain has the sheer neurochemical fuel to remain alert.
I mean, the chemical baseline is established, yes. The adenosine blockade is basic psychopharmacology, and I don't dispute that caffeine increases baseline arousal.
Right, but anyone who has had too much coffee knows that pure, unadulterated arousal often leads to frantic restlessness. You feel energized, but scattered.
Very scattered.
That is where the gum comes in, providing what we can call a sensory ceiling. Chewing gum engages peripheral sensory motor channels, specifically through the trigeminal nerve.
Right. The largest of the cranial nerves.
Exactly. When you engage it rhythmically through the physical act of mastication, you are literally pumping increased blood flow to the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex. Even more importantly, the chewing provides a continuous fidget outlet.
A physical release valve.
Yes. It gives your central nervous system a productive, rhythmic way to discharge that jittery, anxious energy that caffeine often produces. The synergy fundamentally solves the activation gap of waiting for the caffeine to hit. You get high mental alertness from the coffee, but grounded, intensely managed energy from the gum.
The physiological cascade you were describing is entirely accurate. The trigeminal stimulation is well documented in the data.
But you don't buy it as a solution.
I look at this from a completely different angle. While this biological optimization is clever, it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of procrastination itself.
How so? Where is the disconnect?
The disconnect happens because this protocol operates on the underlying assumption that procrastination is a physiological deficit. It assumes you are not working because your adenosine levels are too high or your arousal potential is too low.
Which it often is.
But if we look at the psychology of work, procrastination is primarily driven by emotional avoidance. People avoid complex tasks because of a fear of failure, perfectionism, boredom, or a fundamental lack of clarity about what to do next. Fuel is not navigation.
Fuel is not navigation. That is an interesting way to put it.
It is true, though.
Pumping the central nervous system full of dopamine and trigeminal stimulation without a clear plan or emotional readiness does not magically produce deep work. What it actually produces is energetic distraction.
Energetic distraction? By that, you mean you have the capacity, but it gets misdirected?
Exactly. Think about what happens when you are deeply anxious about drafting a high-stakes proposal. Adding caffeine and aggressive sensory motor stimulation doesn't magically resolve your anxiety about the proposal's content.
Well, no, of course not.
In many cases, the physical arousal actually amplifies the psychological anxiety. Because your arousal potential is peaked, you have to do something. So instead of doing the hard work, you suddenly find yourself aggressively color-coding your digital calendar for the next 5 years.
Or entirely reorganizing your email inbox.
Right. You feel incredibly productive because your heart rate is up and you are moving fast, but you haven't actually done the deep work. You're just procrastinating with more vigor.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. Isn't it possible that what we diagnose as emotional avoidance is often just the friction of physical inertia?
Physical inertia?
Yes. If we use this sensory lock, the gum and the coffee, to bridge those first 20 minutes, doesn't the emotional barrier often just dissolve once the body is in motion?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The physical inertia you were talking about is a symptom, not the root cause.
A symptom of what exactly?
Of the underlying psychological avoidance. Increasing arousal does not increase a person's willingness to face cognitive discomfort. If a user is anxious about a task, the dual sensory trigger might actually amplify that anxiety, pushing them toward shallow work.
I think to really examine the validity of that critique, we have to isolate exactly what happens in the moment a person sits down at their desk. Let's look at the activation gap.
The waiting period.
Right. It is a highly vulnerable window. When you sit down with a fresh cup of coffee, ready to tackle high cognition task, the energy is not instantaneous. Caffeine requires systemic delivery.
It has to hit your stomach, pass into the intestine, get absorbed.
Exactly. It has to cross the blood-brain barrier. That mechanical process takes 20 to 30 minutes. And in that waiting room, you fall into the waiting for the kick trap. The brain is incredibly vulnerable.
So people reach for their phones.
They do. You know the kick is coming, so you grant yourself a little grace period. You think, I'll just do a quick scroll on social media until the coffee kicks in.
And then the focus is gone.
Completely. By the time the caffeine hits your bloodstream 30 minutes later, your focus is already shattered by cheap digital trivia. The immediate sensory feedback of the gum as a physical placeholder for focus, keeping you anchored during that delay.
I get the placeholder argument, but I think you are still operating on the premise that reaching for the phone is just about waiting for a chemical kick.
You think it is deeper than that?
Absolutely. When someone reaches for their phone right before a hard task, they are usually hunting for cheap dopamine to soothe the psychological discomfort of the impending work.
But that is precisely why this stack is presented as a highly structured starting gun ritual. The sequence of events is vital here. It isn't just about randomly chewing gum and drinking coffee.
Okay, then what is it about?
It is the aroma of the brew. It is the tactile resistance of physically unwrapping the gum. It is the rhythmic motion of the jaw. When repeated, this creates a conditioned response. It transforms the start of a deep work block from a difficult choice into a physical routine.
A routine that relies heavily on external stimulants.
A routine paired with a micro-commitment. A 60-second action plan, like opening a spreadsheet. You act before the brain's executive functioning center can even second-guess the discomfort.
That sounds highly optimized on paper. It really does. But we cannot ignore the tangible, physiological, and psychological risks of this protocol.
What risks are you most concerned about?
Well, pushing the central nervous system this hard can easily tip sensitive individuals into overarousal. You are stacking a potent stimulant on top of a physical sensory motor stimulant. For many people, that creates a state of frantic panic, or what the literature sometimes refers to as loud thoughts.
That's an interesting point, though, although I would frame it differently. Every tool has edge cases. Think of this stack like installing a governor on a sports car engine.
A governor?
Yeah. The coffee provides the raw horsepower, But the rhythmic mastication acts as the traction control, keeping the energy grounded. As long as you respect the dose, the synergy is what prevents the crash.
I appreciate the sports car analogy, but what happens when the driver relies so heavily on the traction control system that they literally forget how to drive without it?
You think it builds dependency?
I do. And beyond the psychological dependency, let's talk about the gastric irritation. When you start chewing gum, your brain sends a neural signal down to your digestive tract saying, "Hey, get ready, food is incoming."
So the stomach pumps out acid.
Exactly. The stomach responds by aggressively pumping out digestive acids, but you are just generating a ghost meal. And into that highly acidic environment, you are dropping coffee, which is naturally highly acidic, often on an empty stomach.
That is a direct recipe for gastric distress. Sure.
And don't forget the inevitability of tolerance and caffeine crashes. The neurological novelty of the gum stimulation is short-lived. By relying on this stack, you are effectively borrowing energy from tomorrow to pay for today's focus.
I mean, the gastric mechanism is a fair point, and it highlights that every tool has physical limits that must be managed. But is the risk of tolerance really a deal breaker if the tool gets you past the hardest part of the workday?
It is a deal breaker because it leads us to the broader philosophical issue of dependency theater. Relying on a $2 microstack risks creating a reality where deep work is only possible with external stimulants.
Dependency theater. That is quite a phrase.
It is the subtle erosion of personal agency. People start spending 45 minutes dialing in the perfect grind size for their artisanal beans, unwrapping the imported gum, adjusting their monitor height to the exact millimeter.
They optimize the protocol instead of doing the work.
Exactly. The brain tricks them into believing that the preparation ritual is the work. But if we examine the productivity hierarchy, work rituals rank dead last. They sit far behind establishing clear priorities, behind time blocking, and certainly behind sleep.
I don't disagree with the hierarchy at all. But the source material specifically accounts for this via the 7-day calibration protocol. The system is designed to be tested.
The testing week, right?
Yes. On days 1 through 3, you use the full stack. On days 4 and 5, coffee only. On days 6 and 7, gum only. It is engineered precisely so it remains an on-ramp for heavy lifting days, not a permanent identity.
But the very existence of a 7-day calibration protocol reveals how incredibly easy it is for this to become a psychological crutch.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because calling it dependency theater ignores how all habits are built. Isn't building any structured ritual a temporary dependency until the neurological pathway is paved? We are using a temporary catalyst to build permanent structural habits.
You are comparing a chemical dependency loop to building a habit.
Think about trying to drive a heavy wooden cart through a dense, overgrown forest. This chemical stack is like a temporary machete. It clears the psychological brush just enough for you to get the cart moving.
Eventually, you carve a permanent dirt road, and you won't need the machete anymore.
I like the machete metaphor, but we have to be honest about the tools. A machete cuts vines. It doesn't alter your internal neurochemistry. Caffeine does.
It is a potent multiplier, certainly. But for the average person deeply struggling with procrastination, the multiplier almost always becomes the substitute. They medicate the symptom with gum instead of curing the disease by breaking down their massive project into manageable steps.
I think this is a perfect moment to synthesize where we have landed, because the practical nuances here are critical. I have argued today that the coffee gum stack is a profound biologically grounded starting gun.
And a very effective one, chemically speaking.
Right. It effectively bridges the activation gap through synergistic neurochemical and sensory motor inputs. It turns that dangerous 20-minute window of vulnerability into an automatic physical routine.
And I have summarized that while the biological arousal is real, it cannot navigate a lack of direction. Over-relying on it risks ignoring the emotional roots of procrastination, and it seriously risks eroding personal agency.
Yet, despite our different framing, I think we have found some very significant common ground. We both emphatically agree that this stack is a multiplier rather than a substitute for discipline.
Absolutely. The math is simple, right? 10 times 0 is still 0.
If you don't have a clear task, all the caffeine in the world will just make you a highly energized procrastinator. True productivity relies on structural habits.
And we agree that the underlying cause of procrastination, whether it is a lack of energy or a lack of direction, must be honestly diagnosed by the user.
Yes, if you genuinely don't know the next step of the project, you need a better plan, not a $2 stack.
It really reflects the complexity of human focus. Bridging the gap between physiological stimulation and psychological readiness requires ongoing calibration.
There is definitely much more to explore in the material regarding how sensory inputs affect cognition.
Which brings us back to where we started, that blinking cursor on the blank document. We will leave it to you, the listener, to decide for yourself if your own procrastination requires a physiological kickstart or a structural overhaul. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the mind's mechanics. Until next time.